3 days. That's all it took for a group of people with too much power and not enough common sense to nearly kill my mother. When I pulled into my driveway that January evening, the thermometer on my truck read 5 degrees below zero, but somehow the inside of my cabin felt even colder. And before that week was over, 3 people who thought they were untouchable would be sitting in jail cells wondering how everything had gone so wrong. My name is Ethan Mercer. I'm 43 years old. I run a small forestry contracting business in northern Idaho, and until all this happened, I honestly thought the biggest problem in my life was keeping up with fuel prices and replacing worn-out equipment. My mother, Helen, is 75. She has severe COPD, diabetes, and enough medical equipment in our little cabin to make it look like a miniature hospital. A few years ago, after my father passed away, I moved back onto the family property to help take care of her. It wasn't some grand sacrifice. She spent decades taking care of me. Now it was my turn. Our place sat on a hillside overlooking a newer luxury development called Summit Ridge Estates. 40-something oversized houses with heated driveways, private security, and people who seemed to believe money could solve every problem life ever created. Most of the homeowners were decent enough. The problem was the HOA board, especially its president, Grant Holloway. Grant was one of those guys who never entered a room. He arrived. You could practically hear his ego before you heard his voice. The strange thing was that our property wasn't even part of Summit Ridge. My grandfather bought this land back in the 1960s. The development didn't show up until decades later. Legally, they had no authority over us. But that never stopped Grant from acting like he owned the entire mountain. For almost 2 years, he sent letters demanding HOA dues. He sent warnings about paint colors, driveway maintenance, landscaping requirements, and once, unbelievably, a complaint about a barn that had been standing longer than he'd been alive. Every time, my attorney sent the same response. Not subject to HOA authority. End of discussion. Apparently, Grant never liked hearing the word no. The week everything exploded started with a routine work trip. I had a forestry contract about 3 hours away and expected to be gone for 72 hours. Before leaving, I checked Mom's oxygen concentrator, stocked her medications, tested the backup battery system, and asked our neighbor, Martha Jensen, to keep an eye on her. Martha had been living nearby almost as long as we had. Around here, neighbors still checked on each other. That's just how things worked, or at least that's how they were supposed to work. On the evening of January 18th, I finally headed home through a snowstorm that had been building all afternoon. The roads were awful. Visibility came and went. I remember feeling relieved when I turned onto our dirt road because all I wanted was a hot meal and a few hours of sleep. Then I noticed something strange. The cabin was completely dark. No porch light. No glow from the windows. Nothing. At first I thought maybe the power company had an outage somewhere on the mountain. But as I got closer, I realized every house in Summit Ridge was lit up like a Christmas card. Just not mine. My stomach dropped. I parked, ran through the snow, and opened the front door. The blast of cold air that hit me felt like opening a commercial freezer. Inside, everything was silent. No hum from the refrigerator. No oxygen machine. No furnace fan. Just silence. The indoor temperature had dropped into the 30s. One of the pipes in the kitchen had burst. Ice covered part of the floor. I started shouting for my mother before remembering she wasn't there. Panic hit me so hard I could barely think straight. Then my phone rang. It was Martha. Her first words were, "Don't panic, Ethan. Your mom's with me." I don't think I've ever felt relief and terror at the same time before. I drove straight to Martha's house. While I walked in, Mom was wrapped in 3 blankets, sitting beside a space heater, her face pale and exhausted. The portable oxygen tank beside her was nearly empty. She looked up at me and tried to smile, but she didn't have enough breath to finish it. Martha explained everything. The power had gone out the morning after I left. She checked on Mom that afternoon and found the house getting dangerously cold. When the oxygen system failed, she moved her across the road before things got worse. Then Martha handed me her phone. "You need to see this." The photos showed a maintenance truck from Summit Ridge parked beside the utility easement. 2 men stood near the power line with cutting equipment. The timestamp was from the morning our electricity failed. One of them was smiling directly at the camera. For a few seconds, I just stared at the screen. My brain refused to process what I was looking at. Then anger started replacing shock. Someone hadn't accidentally damaged our power line. Someone had intentionally cut it. And deep down, before I even made a single phone call, before I spoke to law enforcement, before I confronted anyone, I already knew exactly who was behind it. The next morning started before sunrise. Truthfully, I never really slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing my mother sitting in Martha's living room, struggling to breathe, while somebody somewhere had decided that enforcing their imaginary authority mattered more than a human life. Around 6 o'clock, I drove back to the cabin and started documenting everything. The ruined insulin, the frozen pipes, the damaged electrical connection, the temperature readings. Every photo felt like another piece of evidence in a case I hadn't realized I was building. By 8 o'clock, a deputy from the sheriff's office arrived. He listened carefully, took notes, examined Martha's photographs, and followed me down to the utility easement where the damaged line crossed a section of land bordering Summit Ridge. The cut wasn't accidental. Even I could see that. It was clean and deliberate. The deputy agreed. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing, he said. About an hour later, I got the phone call I expected. Grant Holloway wanted to meet. We met outside the entrance monument of Summit Ridge, one of those giant stone signs people build when they want visitors to know they spent too much money. Grant arrived wearing an expensive winter coat and the kind of expression that suggested he believed he was the smartest person in every room. "Ethan," he said, spreading his hands like he was greeting an old friend, "this situation is unfortunate." Unfortunate. That was the word he chose. Not dangerous. Not reckless. Not criminal. Unfortunate. I asked him directly whether his maintenance crew had cut my power line. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he launched into a speech about property standards, community regulations, and violations. Finally, he said, "Your electrical service crossed land governed by Summit Ridge regulations." I stared at him. My mother almost died. He shrugged. Actually shrugged. Rules exist for a reason. Looking back now, that was the moment he lost. He just didn't know it yet. Most bullies think power comes from pushing people around. Real power comes from understanding consequences, and Grant had absolutely no understanding of the consequences he was creating. After leaving that meeting, I drove straight to my attorney's office. His name was Russell Kane, a gray-haired lawyer who had represented my family for years. Russell listened quietly while I explained everything. Then he opened a file cabinet and pulled out documents I hadn't seen since my grandfather died. Property records, easements, historical agreements, survey maps. For nearly 2 hours, we reviewed paperwork dating back decades. That's when we found the clause. Back in 1971, when my grandfather granted access for a water transmission line crossing our property, he negotiated protections most people would never think to request. One section caught Russell's attention immediately. If any action by the beneficiary of the easement endangered the health or safety of occupants residing on the Mercer property, access rights could be suspended pending resolution. Russell looked at me over his glasses. "You know what this means, right?" I knew exactly what it meant. The main water supply feeding Summit Ridge crossed our land. Legally, documented, recorded, protected. And suddenly the people who had spent years pretending property rights didn't matter were about to receive a very expensive lesson about property rights. That evening, after filing reports with Adult Protective Services and submitting formal complaints to both the county prosecutor and utility regulators, I walked down to the control valve located near the Lower Creek crossing. I stood there for several minutes before touching it. Contrary to what people imagine, moments like that don't feel triumphant. They feel heavy. I knew hundreds of people would be affected by what I was about to do, most of whom had absolutely nothing to do with Grant's decisions. But I also knew something else. If people with authority could intentionally disconnect life-sustaining medical equipment without consequences, then there wasn't really any law at all. At exactly 9 o'clock, I turned the valve. The following morning, my phone exploded. Calls, text messages, emails. Most of them came from Summit Ridge residents wondering why their water pressure had suddenly vanished. By lunchtime, social media pages connected to the community were filled with complaints. At first, many residents blamed weather conditions. Then somebody mentioned the conflict involving my property. Then somebody else posted Martha's photographs. By evening, the narrative had changed completely. People were asking questions the HOA board couldn't answer. Day 3 brought the moment everything shifted into another gear. While reviewing footage from one of my trail cameras positioned near the easement, I found something I hadn't expected. The camera overlooked a section of roadway near the power line. On the footage, 2 maintenance workers from Summit Ridge stepped out of their truck carrying cutting equipment. One of them pointed toward my cabin. The other laughed. Then, clear as day, they severed the electrical connection. What happened next shocked even me. One worker looked directly toward the camera's location and said, "Let's see how long the hillbilly lasts without power." Then both men laughed. I watched the footage 3 times. Then 4. Every time, my anger grew colder. Not hotter, colder. The kind of anger that becomes determination. That evening, I uploaded the video online. I wasn't expecting much. Maybe a few thousand views. Maybe local attention. Instead, the internet grabbed hold of the story like gasoline finding a spark. Overnight, the video spread across social media. By the next afternoon, hundreds of thousands of people had watched it. By the following morning, the number approached 1 million. Messages poured in from strangers across the country. Some were angry, some supportive. Some shared stories about abusive HOAs in their own communities. News stations started calling. Radio hosts started asking for interviews. Even national legal commentators began discussing the case. Meanwhile, things inside Summit Ridge were getting ugly. Residents who had spent days hauling bottled water from grocery stores were becoming increasingly furious. Homeowners demanded explanations from the board. Emergency meetings were scheduled, then canceled, then rescheduled. Grant tried issuing statements claiming legal authority. Nobody believed him anymore. The video had changed everything. For the first time, people weren't hearing accusations. They were seeing evidence. On day 4, I appeared on a regional television news program. I brought the damaged insulin cooler. I brought photographs of the frozen cabin. I brought documentation from my mother's physician explaining her dependence on powered medical equipment. During the interview, the reporter asked a question that turned out to be devastating for Grant. "Mr. Mercer, the HOA claims multiple warning notices were sent before action was taken. Did you receive any?" Not one. The station decided to verify the claim. Within 24 hours, reporters had contacted postal officials and reviewed available delivery records. No certified mail existed. No documenti notices existivo. No evidence supported anything the HOA leadership had claimed. Their entire defense started collapsing in public. Then came the financial investigation. Honestly, nobody saw that coming. What began as a dispute over electricity suddenly attracted attention from county auditors reviewing Summit Ridge records. Residents demanded transparency. Auditors started digging. And once they started digging, they found things nobody expected. Large transfers, missing documentation, reserve funds that didn't seem to match approved expenditures. One report suggested hundreds of thousands of dollars designated for emergency infrastructure had somehow been redirected into an ambitious golf course expansion project Grant had championed for years. Suddenly, the story wasn't just about my mother's safety anymore. It was about money. A lot of money. The kind of money that attracts investigators. By day 7, Summit Ridge felt less like an upscale community and more like a pressure cooker waiting to explode. Homeowners were angry. Reporters were circling. Investigators were asking questions. The board members were issuing contradictory statements almost daily. And through all of it, my mother kept asking the same question every evening while sitting beside her temporary oxygen equipment at Martha's house. Why would anybody do this? I wish I had a simple answer. Maybe it started with ego. Maybe it started with power. Maybe Grant simply couldn't tolerate being told no. Whatever the reason, events had moved far beyond his control now, and the explosion everyone could feel coming was finally about to arrive. The explosion arrived on day 8. Summit Ridge's emergency homeowners meeting was held inside the community clubhouse, And from what I heard later, people started showing up nearly an hour early because nobody trusted the board anymore. I wasn't even sure I wanted to attend. Part of me wanted to stay home with my mother and let the lawyers handle everything. But another part of me knew that if people were finally willing to listen, they deserved to hear the truth directly. When I walked into that room, the atmosphere felt electric. Not angry in the normal sense. Angry in the way people get when they realize they've been lied to for a long time. Nearly every seat was filled. Homeowners stood along the walls. Some had spent the entire week driving to gyms and relatives' houses just to shower. Others were furious about the financial reports that had started leaking into public view. Grant Holloway sat at the front table looking nothing like the confident man I'd confronted days earlier. He still wore the expensive suit. He still carried himself like he was important. But the room had stopped believing in him. And once people stop believing, titles don't mean much. The meeting started with excuses, then explanations, then blame shifting. Grant tried to argue that everything had been done in the community's best interest. A few homeowners actually laughed out loud. Finally, someone demanded that my trail camera footage be played for everyone. The room went silent. The video began. You could hear every word. You could see every action. You could watch the workers cut the line and laugh afterward. Nobody spoke for several seconds after it ended. Then a woman near the back stood up and pointed toward the board. They almost killed that man's mother. The room erupted. People shouted over each other. Questions came from every direction. Homeowners wanted to know who approved the action. They wanted to know where the warning letters were. They wanted to know what happened to the emergency reserve fund. Grant couldn't answer most of it. Then the final blow landed. A representative from the Postal Inspection Service confirmed there was no evidence any certified warnings had ever been sent. The board's entire story collapsed right there in front of everyone. What happened next wasn't close. The vote to remove the board passed by an overwhelming margin. Years of frustration, resentment, and distrust came pouring out all at once. By the end of the night, Grant and most of his allies had lost every position they held. But losing their positions turned out to be the least of their problems. 2 days later, just after sunrise, several state police vehicles rolled into Summit Ridge. I happened to be outside checking on repairs when I saw them pass. Within an hour, the entire county knew what was happening. Investigators had completed enough of their work to move forward. Grant Holloway was arrested. The maintenance supervisor who appeared in the video was arrested. The HOA treasurer was arrested. The charges included reckless endangerment, unlawful utility interference, and financial crimes connected to the missing reserve funds. I won't pretend I felt sorry for them. I didn't, but I also didn't celebrate. Watching people get handcuffed isn't nearly as satisfying as movies make it look. Mostly I felt tired. The kind of tired that settles into your bones after weeks of stress, fear, and uncertainty. The real victory had never been about seeing somebody arrested. The real victory was the fact that my mother was still alive to witness it. A few days later, the newly elected board requested a meeting. The difference between them and the previous leadership was obvious immediately. They showed up prepared, respectful, honest. They admitted mistakes had been made and asked what it would take to resolve the situation. Negotiations lasted most of the day. By the time everything was finished, a settlement agreement had been reached. The community would fund restoration of all damages to the property. Permanent underground electrical service would be installed. Written legal guarantees would confirm our land remained entirely outside HOA authority. Additional compensation would help cover medical expenses, repairs, and future care needs. Most people thought that would be the end of it. But I had one more condition. If this entire nightmare had taught me anything, it was how vulnerable elderly people can become when critical systems fail. I requested funding for a dedicated medical backup power program serving seniors throughout the county. Not just my mother, everyone. To my surprise, the new board agreed. Months later, generators were installed for dozens of elderly residents who previously had no emergency backup options. My mother's generator became the first one completed. The first time we tested it, she sat in her recliner listening to the equipment hum quietly in the background. Then she smiled and said, "I think your father would have liked this. I think he would have too." As for Grant, he eventually accepted a plea agreement. He lost his professional licenses, his reputation, and most of the influence he'd spent years building. The maintenance supervisor served time. The financial investigations continued long after the headlines disappeared. Summit Ridge itself changed dramatically. The HOA was eventually dissolved and replaced with a much smaller community association that focused only on essential services. New bylaws were adopted, specifically protecting long-standing property owners from future overreach. Funny enough, many of the residents who once viewed me as the stubborn guy on the hill eventually became friends. Turns out most people aren't interested in controlling their neighbors. They just want fairness. These days, life is quieter. Mom's health still has good days and bad days, but she has reliable backup systems, better support, and far more security than before. Sometimes I'll sit on the porch in the evening looking down at the valley lights and think about how differently this story could have ended. If Martha hadn't checked on Mom, if that camera hadn't captured footage, if those records hadn't survived all those years. A dozen small things had to go right after one terrible decision nearly destroyed everything. And that's probably why this story still stays with me. Not because of the arrests, not because of the settlement, but because somewhere along the way, a group of ordinary people decided that power and authority didn't matter more than basic human decency. Now I'm curious what you think. Was shutting off the water justified after what happened to my mother? Or did I go too far? Have you ever dealt with an HOA, local board, or neighbor who abused their authority and pushed things way beyond common sense? Let me know in the comments, because stories like these always spark strong opinions. And honestly, I'd like to hear where you stand.